Have you ever been tempted to ask the question, why me? Of course you have. It's just that when bad things happen to bad people, it's easy to understand why, but we all experience the fact that sometimes bad things happen to good people, and it feels unjust. Like parents who adopt a child out of a terrible situation only to have those children later on reject them. Or a person who heroically tries to save a person in mortal danger and ends up dying themselves. Or a person who tries to come between two parties in conflict to make peace and just ends up hated by people on every side. We might expect smooth sailing when we do the right thing, but it doesn't take very long living in a world like the one we live in before we realize that that's often not the case. And while sometimes God does still the storm, other times he sustains us through the storm. Paul knew all about the difficulties that a person could face from doing the right thing. From the beginning of his Christian ministry, he suffers for his faithfulness to Jesus. Now, Paul understood that things weren't going to go well, and because he understood this, he was able to find peace in the midst of both the metaphorical and the literal storms. And that peace was contagious to the people around him. So last week, we looked at how Paul got arrested when his presence at the temple in Jerusalem caused a riot. In the intervening period of time, his accusers tried to ambush him, but because Paul was instructed by God to share the good news in Rome, he takes his prerogative as a Roman citizen and appeals his case directly to the emperor. And so after a couple of years of sitting in jail, Paul is sent as a prisoner to Rome, and that's where we pick up this story in Acts 27. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day, we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing was already becoming dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives as well." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. While a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together, because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, that's off the Libyan coast.
They lowered the sea anchors and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent beating from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will be just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.' On the 14th night, while we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land, they took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found that it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending that they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved.' So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. 'For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head.' After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food to themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow struck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. So with our limited understanding of the local geography and nautical terminology, this story could be a little bit difficult to understand. It's very detailed. You'll notice there's some we sections here. So Luke is not just recounting something that he's heard from other people, he's an eyewitness in this account, which is why it's very long and detailed. So to sort of put this all in context with maps, Paul begins his journey in prison in Caesarea Maritima, the administrative capital of the Roman province of Judea. He needs to travel close to 3,000 kilometers, halfway across the Mediterranean Sea, to Rome. The first leg of the journey takes them a day's sailing north to Sidon, where Paul gets off to visit some friends. It seems that Julius, the centurion in charge of his guard duty, trusts him and favors Paul. Paul's friends are able to provide his needs for the journey ahead. They move along the southern coast of Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, until they come to the port of Myra. It's important to note that the unfavorable winds have slowed their progress much more than they had anticipated. At Myra, Paul and his fellow prisoners are transferred onto a ship taking grain from Egypt to Rome. As the ship sets out from Myra, the winds really start to slow it down even more, forcing them to divert to the south side of the island of Crete, where they limp into port at Fair Havens. The delay has moved their journey into a much less safe period of time for sailing. Luke notes that by this time, the Day of Atonement had already passed. In the year 59 AD, when most scholars believe this took place, that would have taken place, the Day of Atonement was on September 26th. So sailing in the Mediterranean was considered safe from late May to mid-September. But during the rest of the year, storms, fog, and limited visibility meant that sailing in that area was unpredictable and often dangerous. Now, the Fair Havens are not an ideal place for the ship to stop. They're too exposed to the sea, and because they're carrying grain, which doesn't do well when it gets wet, they're worried that the relentless pounding of the waves over the entire winter is going to waterlog and destroy their cargo. So the ship's pilot and the owner, who stand to make money from selling all of this, they don't want to lose their cargo, so they want to go to a more suitable port. There's one called Phoenix, which is basically north and west, about 80 kilometers from where they are anchored at Fair Havens. And so the idea is that they can sail there and wait out the winter while they're there. Paul, with wisdom from the Holy Spirit, warns that this is a bad idea. But he's overruled by the professionals. The plan is to round the corner and basically just follow the coast, staying really close as they can until they get to Phoenix. But soon after they put out to sea, a gale-forced wind blows them completely off of their expected course, and they are blown in the opposite direction. Now they're in danger of being blown over to the Libyan coast, which is extremely dangerous. And then they lose sight of the stars and the sun, which in the days before GPS was what they needed to navigate. And so they are completely lost. Unbeknownst to them, though, the storm actually blows them generally in the right direction. God promised Paul that he is going to stand trial in Rome before Caesar. And so God also promises to save his traveling companions. And while everyone else is despairing, Paul holds on to hope and encourages everyone that they will survive. When they see that they're nearing land and it's a sandy beach, not jagged rocks, which would spell disaster, they attempt to run the ship onto the beach. But a sandbar stops them, and then the relentless pounding of the surf starts to break up the ship. Now, Roman soldiers who are guarding prisoners would be executed if their prisoners were to escape. And so the guards there they are about to execute the prisoners when the centurion catches wind of the plan and stops it, and everybody manages to get safely to shore. So when we look at this story, what do we understand from Paul's experiences? How can we relate to those experiences, and what does his example show us about how we ought to live as Christians in this world? Well, first, Paul speaks the truth, but when his truth is ignored, he doesn't sulk because he doesn't get his own way. Paul's advice about not moving on from Fair Havens is wise advice. And no doubt it was difficult for him when people rejected it. It would be easy for him to become vindictive. Fine, I hope you die in this storm. Or to become despondent. Oh, I see the truth, but nobody else doesn't. Now we're all going to die. Paul, as a prisoner, has no choice but to go along for the ride when the people in authority over him make a bad decision. Now, chances are you and I can relate to this. Not the part about being a prisoner on a boat in this case, but because we understand that sometimes the decisions of people in authority over us can have negative consequences for us. We might see this, for example, when our government does something contrary to the command of Jesus, like moving towards war when they ought to be pursuing peace, or by implementing policies that favor the rich at the expense of the poor. We might encounter it at work, where maybe our boss has decided to pursue a new policy that you feel treats the customers dishonestly. When we speak up the truth and say that's not what we should be doing and are overruled, how do we respond? When Paul's prophetic advice is ignored, he has no way of getting off the boat. He's going to suffer the same consequences as everyone else for someone else's foolishness. And while Paul does have an I told you so moment, he's not embittered by those whose short-sightedness have brought this ordeal that he's experiencing along with them. And so we should follow Paul's example. When people want to go a way that Jesus shows us is foolish, we must speak the truth in love, not in arrogance. But if they ignore us, we shouldn't throw a pity party or give up on the well-being of other people around us. Instead, we should patiently endure and work for the good, even of the people who are to blame for the mess that we're in. We must remember that Jesus suffered and died for our sin. He doesn't resent us because our selfishness and foolishness forced him to do that in order to save us. Instead, his love means that even when it costs him, he still works for our good and celebrates our redemption. So let's remember to keep on working for the good of those whose mistakes cause us to suffer. The second lesson that we can learn from the example of Paul is how he maintains hope in a situation that appears hopeless. Just how hopeless is this situation? Not many of us have a lot of experience with sailing, but let's put it in another way. Let's say it's the weekend and you develop a rash. And you're like, I should get this looked at. It's a long time till I could probably get into the doctor, so I'm going to go to the emergency room. Your full expectation is the doctor will look at that and say, oh, nothing to be too concerned about. Here's some ointment. Put it on 3 times a day. Keep the area clean and dry. You'll be back to normal in no time. But instead, when you get there, you show the doctor the rash, and the doctor's eyes go wide. Her jaw goes slack, and all the color drains from her face. And she turns around and yells, "Everybody in PPE, stat!" When it's time for the professionals to freak out, then you know it's maybe time to freak out. This storm is that serious. This isn't just an unpleasant time for a bunch of weak-kneed landlubbers that just need to get their sea legs under them. This is a life and death struggle that drags on for weeks. Eventually, the professional sailors try to abandon the ship, leaving everyone else to the tender mercies of the sea. That's how serious it is. And when everyone around him despairs of life, Paul is able to stay confident because he believes that God is bigger than the storms that we face. Paul stands on the promise that God has given him that he will stand before Caesar. As an empathetic and caring person, even that promise isn't enough because he cares for the safety of his traveling companions, Luke and Aristarchus, for the centurion, Julius, who has treated him humanely when he's not required to, for the other people on board who are just minding their own business trying to get to Rome. Paul's assurance that God has promised to save them gives those people peace in an impossible situation. Now, we live in a time where it's also easy for us to be captivated by fear and despair. Maybe you look at the news and you just want to stop reading the news. We may worry about the general retreat of democracy in the world and wonder where it's going to lead. We might look at increasing tensions and hostilities between great powers in the world and wonder if we're headed towards a great conflict. We might look at the trend of increasing secularization and with so many kids walking away from faith and wonder what it's going to mean for my children and my family. But to follow Paul's example means that we fix our attention not on the storms that we face, but on the God who goes with us through those storms. No doubt Paul experiences the same horrible seasickness as everyone else. Like the rest, he's cold and wet and hungry and tired, but he can endure differently because he knows that he's going to stand before Caesar. We can also stand faithfully or confidently in God's faithfulness. This doesn't insulate us from the challenges that we're going to face. Christians aren't spared from hardship any more than other people, and often those hardships aren't even their fault. Things like illness, unemployment, or the abandonment by a spouse can happen to a person who is faithfully following God. But while these things hurt, sometimes terribly, we experience them differently if we know that in the midst of the storm, God is with us. Some things even end in death, but even death isn't the end of the story because of God's promise of resurrection. If we keep our eyes on Jesus, we can have hope in a seemingly hopeless situation. It's often this hope that defies people's understanding of what a person can be hopeful in that causes people to seek out Jesus. Peter tells us, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Paul's hope leads the people to trust God, that God can deliver them, and so they are encouraged. God sometimes allows us to experience the kind of situation in which most people would be hopeless, because as we hope in Him, our hope becomes a beacon that shows God at work in our lives. And while Paul's attitude encourages his shipmates, his presence also saves them. God is saving His servant Paul, and while He's at it, saving the rest of them because they are with Paul. And this reminds us that God's blessing on us may preserve our community for our sake. A faithful church doesn't mean that a community will go God's way, but God may save a community from catastrophe because of the presence of a faithful church. When Jesus says that the church is the salt of the earth, one of the meanings of this is that we are a preserving presence. Just as salt present in meat kept it from perishing in the days before refrigeration, so the presence of salty people, salty in the way that Jesus is talking about, can save the people around us from perishing. So when God allows communities or nations to go through difficult times, we can remember that our presence as God's people among them can be a preserving and saving influence if we are faithful. So while we desire smooth sailing, we often encounter rough seas. We can pray that God will still the storm, and sometimes He does. But even if God doesn't remove the storm, we can have confidence that He goes with us through the storm. In the midst of that, our job is to speak for Him to a world that might not recognize His wisdom or His authority, working for the good of those who fail to heed His words. Our job is to encourage others by holding on to hope in God in situations that otherwise seem hopeless. And our job is to be a preserving presence in our communities. Our hope in God's faithfulness means that we can respond differently in all types of storms. The difference in our response can mean salvation for others. So let's weather the storm with a conviction that God goes through it by our side.